are. Welcome to both of you. Let me start with you, Haraç Grigoryan. 1915, I want to just fill in a little bit of the history. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. What led specifically to the killing of so many Armenians?
Well, I think there was a general feeling that the Armenians were not to be trusted. And even before that, there was a policy of Turkification by the Young Turks dating back to 1908. And the Armenians were viewed as a threat to Turkish identity and Turkish security. And there were orders to rid the country of the community.
For Turks, this history is tied to the creation, the end of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern Turkish state.
Precisely. This was the World War I when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and as the empire was collapsing, the government of the empire at that time decided to move the Armenians from eastern Turkey, where they lived, into Syria, so from one part of the empire to another part. And the idea would be that they'll be away from the advancing Russian armies. The fear was that the Armenians would work with the Russian armies to undermine the empire. What happened next was a disaster. Hundreds of thousands of people died, sometimes of famine and disease, but usually in the hands of irregulars, Kurdish irregulars and others who carried out attacks. And I think that's really the core of the issue.
Well, to the core of the issue, is the extent of the killing disputed, or is it the intent? The intent,
right?
That word genocide.
Right. It's the intent. It's not the extent. The intent was to rid the country of Armenians, and it wasn't a benign movement. It was under duress, and there was killing all along the way, killing and rape and pillage and all kinds of massacres committed.
What's your reading on why this has stayed in dispute for so long? What are the stakes here?
I think the stakes are quite substantial for the Armenian people. It's a traumatizing event. It's a defining event, and until it's acknowledged and apologies are rendered, it'll remain a defining moment. I think for the Turkish government, there are three factors that prevent it from acknowledging and apologizing. The first is it's a shameful act, and no government wants to admit to it. The second is there is some concern about reparations and land claims. And the third is there are substantial nationalists, right-wing nationalists in Turkey that are violently opposed to such acknowledgement.
And how strong are these factors? For example, the reparations issue. Who's pushing for that? What kind of claims would there be?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to know exactly. I think for the majority of Armenians now, 100 years hence, some of those claims, particularly the lands, are overblown. I don't see Armenians living in Paris and New York and Los Angeles wanting to claim lands in eastern Anatolia. It's a symbolic thing, I think, more than anything else.
What about as it's seen from the Turkish side?
One issue is that these events happened in 1915 when the Ottoman Empire existed, and that empire exists no more. There's a new country called modern Turkey, and a lot of Turks have a difficulty connecting their new country to an old empire. Although Turkey is out of the Ottoman Empire, there is no direct legal continuity. People refute that. But that's one. Second, many Turks, when you ask them about how they feel about the death of Armenians, they'll say, well, maybe that happened, but you should also remember that 40% of Turks, Turkey is a country of 77 million people, have parents, 40% have parents who were expelled from the Balkans and from Russia because of their religion and brutalized during the process. So they fail to understand why there's so much attention singularly on the Armenian suffering and not their own suffering. So perhaps the narrative has to be, for the Turkish side, also about acknowledging their suffering, given that millions and millions of them were brutalized in the hands of Russians and the Balkan states.
I wonder now, 100 years later, do you see changes in the world attitude? You certainly see more world leaders speaking up recently.
Well, I think there's a greater propensity to acknowledge that this was an act of genocide. I mean, Pope Francis having used that word explicitly, I think is very important. And the fact is, Turkish newspapers today, one of the most important that my colleague will probably refer to, in bold Armenian letters, basically said, you know, we must acknowledge this.
So there are shifts happening.
I agree. I think we're moving forward. There are some really good positive signs. The Turkish Prime Minister express remorse for the descendants of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. A Turkish newspaper came out with an Armenian headline. There were Armenian demonstrators and ceremonies held in Istanbul today. These are things that could not have happened 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I think we are really at the crux of a better term of a relationship between Turks and Armenians.
Very interesting living history, right?